I'm Dr. B and welcome back to my Indigenous Studies Masterclass. We've all heard the confusion: Native American, American Indian, Indian, Indigenous, tribe, or nation. Some people use these terms interchangeably, but do they mean the same thing? The answer is no, and getting these words right isn't about political correctness because these words have power. They are rooted in law, history, and cultural identity. And using the wrong word can erase a people's legal status. And using the right word can affirm their sovereignty. So for today's episode, we're building our toolkit. This is Terminology 101. We're going to talk about these terms and these concepts and explain why they matter. First, the most important grounding: there is no one single indigenous cultures. We're talking about hundreds of different distinct tribal nations. Different languages, different kinship systems, governments, ceremonies, and homelands. Indigenous nations do share common threads, even a common history with settler colonialism, but each tribal community defines itself. Let's start with the term Indian. Many tribal people no longer refer to themselves as Indians. Some Native people consider it to be the colonizer's term because when Christopher Columbus landed in the Bahamas, he thought he was in India, thus we became Indians. And of course, the term lumps us all together as if we are all the same, which we are not. Now keep in mind, there are some tribal people who still call themselves Indian, and personally, I have no trouble with that. I always tell people, call individuals what they want to be called. And there are some organizations that use the word Indian, like the American Indian Movement or the National Congress of American Indians. And there's congressional laws like the Indian Child Welfare Act and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. Personally, I think it's best to use the term Indigenous or Indigenous peoples. Indigenous is a global concept. It means the original peoples of a place who have a distinct culture and long relationship to their ancestral homelands, waters before colonization. This term connects the Maori in Aotearoa, the Sami people in Scandinavia, and the Maya in Guatemala. In the United States, Indigenous typically means Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian communities, with each having their own legal status and history. But here is the single most important takeaway. Whenever possible, use the name of the tribal nation: the Haudenosaunee, the Dene, the Yurok, the Thanaatam, the Mono, or Yokuts. Why? Because these aren't just cultural groups or communities. These are actual nations. In U.S. constitutional law, tribes are sovereign nations, and this has been articulated in early Supreme Court decisions known as the Marshall Trilogy. The first two cases set up the complex domestic dependent nation status. The third case, Worcester versus Georgia, was incredibly clear about the inherent sovereignty of tribal nations. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote that Indian nations have always been considered distinct, independent political communities, retaining their original rights as undisputed possessors of the soil from time immemorial. From time immemorial is the key. Sovereignty wasn't something given to tribal communities, it's something that they always had since the beginning of time. This is why you often hear about government to government relationships between tribal communities and the United States government. So tribal communities are nations, always have been and still are today. Okay, this brings us to recognition. This is a legal and political term, not a cultural one. As of today, there are 574 federally recognized tribes and Alaska Native villages. This recognition affirms the sovereign-to-sovereign relationship with the United States. It's what opens the door to treaty obligations and federal programs. There are some tribal nations that are recognized by their state and not the federal government. This recognition is real and important to these tribal communities, but it does not carry the same legal and political weight as federal acknowledgement, and these communities do not have access to the same federal programs as federally recognized tribes. I know, it's confusing. This is a crucial point to make. Federal acknowledgement is not a certificate for authenticity. There are dozens of tribes that have existed since the beginning of time, since time immemorial, and do not have federal acknowledgement and have been fighting for this legal status for decades. And we'll explore some of this history more in another episode. Okay, if tribes are nations, how do they determine who their citizens are? This is called enrollment. Every federally recognized tribe has the inherent and sovereign right to determine how they enroll their tribal citizens. Some use lineal descendancy, others use blood quantum. The idea or concept of blood quantum is incredibly controversial because it's not an indigenous idea. It was a system imposed by the United States government with the racist goal of breeding out Native Americans and stealing indigenous resources. Today, many nations are moving away from blood quantum standards, and some tribes still use them. But the key takeaway is tribal nations get to define their own citizenship policies. Okay, let's talk about the legal pillars that define this nation-to-nation relationship. You need to know 4 concepts: treaties, the trust responsibility, the reservation system, and Indian country. Let's start with treaties. Up to 1871, the United States negotiated over 370 treaties with Native nations. Why? Because they were nations with their own governments. Some of these treaties were peace offerings, but in most cases they were land concessions. Basically, indigenous nations were pushed off their ancestral homelands and forced to live on reservations. And when they signed these treaties with the United States government, they were promised provisions like education, food, housing, and medical care. Now here's the sad part. Every one of these treaties was broken, but they remain the supreme law of the land under the Constitution. And they still dictate the rights for fishing, hunting, water, and land even today. We need to never forget, these treaties are the law of the land, and tribal nations are holding the federal government responsible for their treaty obligations. All right, let's talk about the all-important trust responsibility. This is the U.S. government's legal duty to protect tribal rights, lands, assets, and fulfill its obligations. And this is not charity. It's a legal duty rooted in treaties and federal law described by the courts as a moral obligation of the highest responsibility and trust. Now the reservation system. A reservation are lands reserved as the homelands for a tribal nation. Some of these reservations were established in the treaties we discussed and others in executive orders. Also, these reservations are held in trust by the federal government. Final note on the reservation system. Colonizers wanted indigenous land and the United States government took it. They placed tribal communities on some of the worst territories, but indigenous people have made the best out of these situations, and these reservations are now home. Also, not every reservation is the same. Some tribal communities have strong, thriving economies, and some have high unemployment and high poverty rates. Okay, Indian country. Related to reservations, you'll often hear this term. This isn't just a casual phrase. It's a formal legal term from U.S. law that defines areas where tribal, federal, and sometimes state jurisdiction applies. Indian country most commonly includes all lands within the reservation boundaries, but also other tribal trust lands and certain native allotments. I know it's a lot, but these concepts are important to understanding this nation-to-nation relationship between federally recognized tribes and the United States federal government. Just remember this, tribal communities are sovereign nations. They have their own governments. They make and regulate laws. They have their own economies. And when you go on to an Indian reservation, you're no longer in the United States of America. You're in Indian country now. So if you ever find yourself on a reservation, make sure to respect those tribal laws. And if you don't, you may have to deal with tribal police, and you don't want that. Now let's zoom in within tribal nations. You'll often hear terms like clans, bands, and confederacies. Clans are kinship groups. They guide identity, responsibility, and leadership. Within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for example, the clan mothers hold real political power. If you missed episode 2, definitely check it out. I talk a lot about the clan mothers and matrilineal societies. Now, bands are typically smaller local groups within a tribal nation. These are simply extended families that have long-standing community ties. Now, confederacies are very powerful alliances of multiple tribal nations, like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the People of the Long House, which consists of 6 distinct tribal nations. Let's talk about harmful terms we need to retire. There are words we just don't use, like the word squaw, which is a racial slur historically tied to sexual violence against Indigenous women. The Department of Interior has formally declared this term a racial slur and removed it from hundreds of federal place names. Redskin is also a racial slur. That's why after a long battle, the Washington football team decided to drop the name. Here's the important thing. Use respectful language when talking about Indigenous nations. And if you don't know the correct term, simply ask. Also, call people what they want to be called. Not all tribal nations and tribal people agree on these terms. Just listen to how tribal communities self-identify. Use full, correct names. This is the heart of respect. So how many Indigenous people live within the United States? The 2020 census gave us 2 key numbers. About 3.7 million people identified as American Indian or Alaska Native alone, but about 9.7 million people identified as American Indian or Alaska Native alone or in combination with other races. As of 2022, there were 324 federally recognized reservations. And the majority of American Indians, over 70%, do not live on these reservations. They live in towns and cities like Los Angeles, Phoenix to New York. This population is often referred to as urban Indians. And many of these tribal people maintain strong connections to their tribal nations. Living off the reservation is a vital part of modern Native life with its own set of political and social dynamics. In other words, you don't have to live on the reservation to be a real Native. So let's wrap up episode 3. What are the key takeaways here? Always begin with diversity. There is no one single Indigenous culture, and always use specific tribal names when possible. Sovereignty is the common ground. Tribal communities are nations, not simply cultural groups, and they get to decide who is a citizen and who is not. The United States government has a legal obligation, a trust responsibility to tribal nations. This is guaranteed in treaty rights. Present and beyond is key. The Native experience is incredibly diverse. Some Natives live on the reservation and some have settled into urban life. When you get these terms right, you're not just speaking more accurately, you're challenging centuries of erasure and respecting the legal and political reality of Indigenous nations. If this episode of my Indigenous Studies Masterclass helped, feel free to share it. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you're a Patreon, I appreciate all the support. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to comment below and I'll do my best to answer them. In episode 4, we're going to tear down some of the biggest stereotypes about Native people. We're going to talk about what's real, what's myth, and how these stereotypes have done incredible damage to Indigenous communities. So see you in the next one.